Hello and welcome to this special edition of To The Point. We'll be in conversation with R V Kanoria, President of FICCI. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Kanoria. My first question, let's get into it right away. The budget is almost upon us. What does the industry want from Pranabda this year?
See, I don't think it's a question of what we want from Pranabda. In all the meetings that we've had with Pranab, with the finance ministry officials and with other ministries, I think it is quite clear that the government is constrained because of very little fiscal space that they have. And I think it's also the onus of industry to try and see as to how this fiscal space can be improved. And what we have been talking about from FICCI is that the government should not merely be talking about revenue augmentation, but also start looking at the expenditure side of the balance sheet. And part of the suggestions which we are making is to ensure that the expenditure comes down, and as far as revenue is concerned, the government should look at measures which are not tax based measures, but measures which are outside the tax system.
Right.
So what we have done is we have said that please keep tax rates at the existing levels.
Right. And not to increase the slab.
Not to increase the slab.
We'll talk about that in a bit. We'll also talk about the current account deficit since you mentioned the expenditure of the government. Before that, let's get to the specifics. Any specific recommendations that either FICCI or industry in general that you've made to Pranabda which might help help Pranabda straddle the very difficult position that he is in? Right?
Yeah. So one specific idea that we have given is to do with subsidies which are meant for the farming community, which is diesel subsidies. And inadvertently, diesel subsidies are also going to the automobile users, I would say. It would be wrong to think that it is going to the automotive industry. I feel that the development of the automotive industry is becoming lopsided because of these subsidies. So what we have suggested is that, it may be difficult for the government to cut back on the subsidies for farmers, because that is something in a political election year it is difficult to do that. But the government should consider a one-time tax on diesel cars which will offset part of the losses which the government has on subsidies.
Something that the oil minister had in fact proposed, and that proposal has gone to the finance minister. Right. And it has. Yeah.
The second idea which we have said is a radical idea, and I don't know how politically palatable it is that the coal sector, industry is faced with constraints of supply of coal, power sector is also faced with supply constraints of coal, and coal is a monopoly business of the government. First of all, there should be competition introduced in the coal sector. Now, in the process of introducing competition, I think the government has a great opportunity to also augment its own finances, because Coal India has a market capitalization of 250,000 crores.
And that issue was oversubscribed if I am not wrong.
Yeah, oversubscribed. And 250,000 crores, I mean one disinvestment will take care of huge problems of fiscal deficit of the government. Right. I don't believe Coal India should be divested as one entity. It should be broken up into several smaller entities so that the concept of competition is imbibed. I think it's more important that competition comes in. Mind you, I am not talking about this disinvestment from any other point of view, but to introduce competition. So that's the second idea which we have given. The third is again a very radical concept, is that again it's politically very difficult to sell this idea in today's circumstance, is to actually find the means of getting back the monies which are lying outside the country and which were part of a system which prevailed prior to the entire liberalization process. And we have to move away from the concept that you want to really target people or whether you want to target the money. I think we should be targeting the money. Yes. And there are schemes which are possible whereby you can target the money.
Right.
In fact, there is one scheme which the UK government has adopted by signing an agreement with the Swiss government to actually attract the monies back through taxation of the monies which are lying outside the UK, which has, which keeps the anonymity of the individual.
Right. Let's talk about the current account deficit for a bit. That, of course, is a problem for not just the government. Of course, it's the whole government and the finance ministry. Now, my figures say that it has weakened much more than expected to 3.6% of GDP in the first half of 2011 and 2012. Now, the position in the third quarter was much tighter than the first two. But the PMEAC report that Dr. Rangarajan released just a few days ago says the position would get better as we go on in the last quarter. Do you agree with that report, first of all?
No, you see, I think current account is dependent upon the trade balance of the country and also on the receipts which we get by way of invisibles, which includes remittances which come in the form of FII remittances and NRI deposits. Personally, I think on the trade front, we are going to have even a more difficult situation than we have had in the past, primarily because oil prices are going up.
So you are saying that external shocks can in fact affect the economy?
I think actually India today is in a very tight position in terms of its ability to cope with external shocks, because we are going to run a $160 to $170 billion trade deficit, and which is going to get compounded if oil prices go up. And if the geopolitical situation in the world continues in the manner that it is at the moment, it is likely that oil prices will go up. I mean, there are all kinds of predictions which talk about $150, and there are even predictions which talk about $175. So I really don't know where it will go, because I am not competent to answer that question. But all I can see is that if you look at the recent past trends, oil prices are certainly on the rise.
Even last week, I think it touched 120. Brent crude touched 120, and that's only going to go higher.
Right. So it is going to create bigger problems as far as our current account.
But where does that leave the government then? What options does the government really have to make sure the CAD, the current account deficit, doesn't overshoot the prescribed limits?
I think, you see, it's not just the current account deficit, it is also the fiscal deficit. Now, the fiscal deficit is a local creation and the current account deficit is an external creation. We have to handle both those issues. And the current account deficit can only improve if our export competitiveness goes up. And also we have, targeted plans to reduce our oil consumption. Funnily enough, we continue to subsidize hydrocarbons. We are subsidizing diesel, we are subsidizing kerosene,
LPG.
And at the same time, we are also subsidizing things like renewable energy. Now, if we have a single point agenda that we are going to get renewable energy going, then automatically, and actually stop this entire hydrocarbon subsidy. I mean, somewhere we'll have to bite the bullet.
Fair point, fair point. You talked about biting the bullet. We'll talk about it after the break. We'll take a short break, come back in conversation with R V Kanoria. We'll come back after the break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. You're still watching To The Point, and we're still in conversation with R V Kanoria. Mr. Kanoria, before the break, you mentioned subsidies on LPG and kerosene and the government biting the bullet. Now, the PMEAC, that report, Dr. Rangarajan's report, has also said that the increase of prices of LPG and kerosene at the central level, also at the state level, electricity tariffs should have a review, a relook. Now, how far do you agree with that? And do you think the government can actually bite the bullet, considering the fact that these decisions, if they ever happen, can be viewed as unpopular?
I think they are not happening because they are viewed as unpopular. There's no question about that. I mean, the point is that there is a middle class in this country which is having to grapple with inflation in any case. So any such decision which is going to further affect their daily ability to service their own lives is going to be difficult. I think the government needs to revisit both the subsidy part of it as well as the duties and tariffs on petroleum products. They have to find a balance to mitigate the impact to the consumer and to the middle class. As far as LPG is concerned, I mean, look, if the UID scheme can truly take off, and if we can find an efficient way to transfer subsidies directly to the people who are supposed to receive it, I think there is a sense of urgency that we need to build on the delivery mechanisms.
Right.
And unless we have those delivery mechanisms, there is always going to be difficulty in biting the bullet.
But since elections are almost over in the 5 states they were going to have, do you see any possibility of the government just might take a tough stand and introduce these reforms that we've been hankering for? Not just everyone has been, the industry has been, economists have been hankering for a review of these policies. Do you see that happening, especially considering the fact that elections are over now?
Much will depend on the election result. I feel that if the government which is in power, this, the UPA government, if they consolidate their position in UP, I think they'll be in a much better position to take difficult decisions.
Right.
If they don't, then I don't know which way we'll go.
Right.
All I know is that we can't afford to move back into a socialist agenda without having the wherewithal and the means to service that agenda, and also the means to actually make sure that there is no leakage in the process of delivering these social programs.
Fair point, fair point. Let's move on to the sectors, different sectors of the economy. Now, the services sector grew by 9.6%, I think, in this current fiscal. It kind of was the sole shining light in an otherwise very stark scenario. Where do you go to see the services sector going in the next fiscal, and also what other sectors would you outline as the most important going forward?
You see, I think services in this country will continue to grow because the service sector is today the least burdened in form of taxation. I feel that in this budget we might see a negative list on the services sector, which means that the tax will be much more broad based than it is currently. I feel the real issue is to get the manufacturing sector going, because the manufacturing sector has the capability of absorbing people who are not necessarily required to have a certain level of education. No, they will have skills, but those skills are not related directly to levels of education, which the services sector needs to have. So I think it's very important to get manufacturing going. Historically, manufacturing has been burdened not only with taxes, but the entire burden of cross subsidization, whether it is power or whether it is fuel, whether it is feedstock or whether it is coal, it all falls on the manufacturing sector. So we have to move away, and if we are to continue our social programs and subsidies, particularly for power, then we have to move it away from cross subsidizing through industry to a method of budgetary support, which means if we are, power generation in this country costs less than 2 rupees, but it is available to industry at anywhere between 5 to 7 rupees. Now, this is a result of populist policies of giving away power for agriculture and for so-called priority sectors at rates which are virtually zero. That burden is falling on the state electricity boards and on the manufacturing and also the services sector. I would say, why not? I mean, it's falling entirely on industry. As a result of that, we are not able to have sustainable programs in the power sector because the electricity boards and the distribution companies are unable to service and finance the purchase of electricity, and generation as an activity becomes uneconomical because you are required to give it for social programs. So we have to ultimately take all these distorting factors away from the economy.
Right. Fair point. Let's talk about growth for a little bit. Now, the Rangarajan, I keep referring to the Rangarajan report because obviously it is a precursor to what might be coming and what projections they have. Very optimistically, Dr. Rangarajan said India has the potential to achieve even 8% growth if, and I stress on the word if, international factors allow us. Do you share Dr. Rangarajan's optimism?
I share his optimism to a limited extent. I do think that the poor economic conditions globally do have an impact in terms of India's growth.
Right.
But I think more importantly, we have to take care of factors which are internal to us. And I think the growth will come from those factors and not so much from the external factors. And I think issues such as infrastructure, issues of high cost of monies, issues of getting, our policies right so that the concept of user pay gets introduced into our system. Our ability to meet our social obligations with a limited cost. I mean, I think there are huge number of internal issues which are still remaining unanswered and pending as part of the reform process. And one very important reform which I feel is critical to the development of infrastructure is pension and insurance reforms, which will provide the long-term capital required to finance long gestation projects like infrastructure. And I can go on and on. I mean, GST is absolutely critical. And I don't know why the states are not able to understand that it helps their tax administration, it helps their tax collection, because in some ways it is self-policing. The person who pays tax at every point of the chain has to ensure that tax has been paid for the previous.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned GST. Also, I think very important is DTC. We'll talk about that a little later. But before that, realistically, very briefly, if you could, realistically, I still think 8% is slightly optimistic. But realistically, do you think at the end of the next fiscal, which starts in March, where do you see India's growth settling finally?
I think it will settle for 2012-13. I expect a growth rate of about 7%. This is what our analysis in FICCI tells us, and I'll tell you the reasons. One is our saving rates have fallen and they have come to a level of about 31-32%, which is still good. But if you analyze the savings, corporate savings have fallen from 2008, they were 17.5%, they've fallen to somewhere around 12.5%, which means that corporates are not reinvesting their monies. Now, part of the growth comes from our internal savings, and a limited part of it also comes from foreign direct investment. Now, foreign direct investment has grown to 51 billion. But what we are not counting is that external investment of Indian corporates abroad has also grown to 44 billion, which means that our net accrual between January and November last year has been only 7 billion. So, growth is going to come out of those 7 billion. You know, earlier what we were getting as inflows was all contributing to growth. Today, because of those outflows, our growth is getting
completely understandable. We'll come back to that point, and GST, like you mentioned, important path-breaking tax reforms like the GST is what we'll discuss after the break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're still watching To The Point. Mr. Kanoria, let me straight ahead go to GST. Now, it is a very important path-breaking tax reform, if you could call it that, probably the legacy of Pranab as a finance minister. There is still no sign of consensus between the states and the centre. Where do you see that going from now on?
I have done this before in my original appeal to the states which are not run by UPA constituents, is that who are in opposition, that please understand that GST is good for the country and good for any state. And I can only appeal that, you know, political sense would prevail and that we would move away from party-based politics to issue-based politics.
Right. Now the question there, do you think the opposition, not just at the state level but at the central level, has played a constructive enough role when it comes to economic reforms?
You know, if you look at it, I mean, I don't think that there's any polarization, because whatever reforms one saw during the BJP government, I mean, they are no different from the type of reforms we want to push through today. So, in terms of ideology, it seems that, you know, both the sets of the ruling and the opposition really want to move in the same direction. But opposition is happening for the sake of opposition, just because there is no political dialogue.
So does that mean our politics is hurting our economy?
Absolutely.
And that obviously is not good for the economy.
Absolutely. You are absolutely right. And if I am not wrong, you also talked about DTC. Here I would also like to urge upon the finance minister that whenever DTC comes in, it should come as a comprehensive law, and that this budget should not do any cherry picking, because that is going to be very dangerous. Because I think there is a strategic component to the DTC which is holistic in nature, and you cannot pick up parts of DTC and implement it during this budget.
Right. Well, let's talk about inflation for a bit now. Inflation has been the government's eternal bugbear, if I could call it now. Dr. Rangarajan says it can settle between 5 to 6% by the end of the next fiscal, which starts in March. Realistically, where do you see inflation going from here?
I also think it can settle at 5 to 6%. But for that, I feel interest rates need to come down. I think that we are tackling a supply side problem with a demand side solution.
Right.
Which means that high interest rates are no way going to control the pricing of primary products. That can only happen if we put in a comprehensive plan to ultimately recognize the shift in consumption patterns of food, which is moving more towards protein rich foods, and we have to do that.
Right.
Interest rates today, I feel, are contributing to a cost push which is having its impact on manufactured products. So if you study inflation for the past 18 to 20 months, it has moved away from primary products and gone into manufactured products. So are we really doing the right thing? And on top of that, it is also inhibiting investment. And if investments don't take place today in the economy, then 2 to 3 years down the road, we are going to have huge supply side.
Right. You mentioned that you, in your meetings with the finance minister, you said not to raise the tax rates, but economists that work for the government, including Dr. Rangarajan, have said raising customs and excise duties to the level of pre-2008 recession would be a good idea. Now, my figures tell me even if just by raising indirect tax rates to 12%, the government might just be able to mop up around 35,000 crores tax revenue. Do you think that would be a good idea? Do you think that step should be taken?
See, I think this step should be taken by looking at what we want to do in the future with GST. If we want to fix the GST rate at say 16%, then we must make sure that the comprehensive rate between the states and the center does not exceed 16%. And I personally am not in favor of raising the excise duties in today's economic scenario.
Right, right. Very quickly, sir, if I could, what do you think the 3 biggest challenges will be for the Indian economy going forward, especially considering the fact we've just recovered from a bad year? 2011 was not just bad for us, it was bad all over the world because of Eurozone, because of the economy on a downturn. But now the IMF says US economy might grow at 1.8%. That, of course, will be good for India and the rest of the world. But what are the biggest challenges that you see for the Indian economy going forward?
I think the biggest challenge is to get political consensus on reform. That is the biggest challenge. In terms of competitiveness, we have to set our infrastructure in order. Right. Our infrastructure is growing at a pace which is lower than that of GDP, which means we are only compounding our problems. Second, we have to make sure that our cost of capital, which is virtually zero in the rest of the world, becomes competitive. It is absolutely, and if you talk about the nation, I think the consolidation of fiscal situation in this country, both the fiscal deficit and the current account deficit, we have to address the expenditure side of the balance sheet.
Right. Do you think the government has to take tough measures, especially Pramda in the budget?
I think the government, nothing can go worse. So I would urge upon the finance minister to take decisions which may look completely tough and unpalatable, but would ultimately help the country. Right.
FDI in retail was a big issue. Some people said that obviously the opposition to that was just because of they wanted to oppose that. But how important is FDI for India, not just in retail, but other sectors that are struggling like aviation?
See, this is a very ultimately, I don't think one should distinguish between the color of capital. Right. We need monies in this country. We need investment in this country. I don't think that we should be worried about, colonization of or another East India company coming in or something like that. So I think these worries are totally unfounded. We need investment, we need technologies, we need upgradation of our systems. Anything which ultimately helps to do that is good for Indian industry and it is good for FDI. I think the driver should be Indian industry. Right. We should be driven by what is good for the country to allow the citizens of this country to fulfill their entrepreneurial expectation.
Right, right, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Kanoria. Thank you so much for talking to Rajya Sabha TV. That was R V Kanoria, President of FICCI. We'll come back with another episode of To The Point next week. Till that time, thank you and goodbye.